Okay, good day dear students. Today we are going to have our lecture number 22 in sociolinguistics, and it's going to be a follow-up of the previous sociolinguistic topics that we were talking about. So in the previous lecture we were discussing the relationship between language and society. So there are several possible relationships between language and society. So we can't say that there is that language would influence society or society would influence language. So one is that social structure may either influence or determine linguistic structure or its behavior. So according to that our society would really have an influence on our language also. So certain evidence may be adduced to support this view. The age grading phenomenon, whereby young children speak differently from older children, and in turn children speak differently from mature adults. So according to this, that we would say that the social structure would influence the linguistic structure. So yes, because a younger child would have a different way of speaking the language, while older child would speak in a different way, and yet again a child would have a completely different way of speaking than a mature adult would. Now, studies which show that the varieties of language that speakers use would reflect such matters as their regional, social or ethnic origin, and possibly even their gender. So gender has a factor also that influences language. Now, how would gender influence language? You can see very clearly in your own society also that there is a difference between the way a male would use language or produce language than from a female. So there are different standards, and according to the society, so it's not just the regional or just the origin where they belong from, but overall it does affect. So other studies which show that particular ways of speaking or choice of words or even rules for conversing are in fact highly determined by certain social requirements. So yes, certain social requirements do affect the way we converse or the way we speak now, and how we would perceive or produce a language also. So a second possible relation would be directly opposed to the first. Linguistic structure or behavior may either influence or determine social structure. Now, when we see as an example, you can see that society does affect language. Now, how can we take that as an example? Because, like, for example, in your culture, let's say in Pakistan, there is a different way how we would use language according to our society. Like, we would speak to an elder in a different way than we would speak to somebody who's younger than us. Now, the French culture is very similar to this too. The French have the same thing as in their society as we do in our Pakistani society, that they would call elder with a different word than that they would do with the younger one. So they would use vowels like up in French for an elder person, and they would use tu in French as a replacement for tum for the younger person. So you see that there is, even though that these are two different societies, now the French culture and the Pakistani culture are very, very different, but this is a similarity. So according to the society, if we would misuse the way language is produced according to the society rules, then people would be offended. You see, even in Pakistan or in French culture, if you would not use up or vowels for elder person, the person would be offended. So it's the same thing in your society too. You cannot call an elder person tum. They would be offended by that. So you would always call them up. Now, that is how society would affect the language according to the culture. And that's how it affects the French culture also. So they have the same thing that, and let's say as an American. Now in American English, there is no difference between an elder or a younger person. So for them there is no tum and up. It's just you. Now, when we use that, now if you say that if you would pick an American and put him into the French culture, then he wouldn't know how to speak the language or how to produce it in a proper way that he wouldn't offend the people of the society. So according to that society, because he's not used to using a difference between an elder or a younger person, so that would be very difficult. But a person that is like, let's say, if a Pakistani goes to a French culture, or French comes to Pakistan, they wouldn't have difficulty in learning the language or using the language in the way according to the society or the social rules, because it's very similar. So the social structure of a language matters a lot, and according to our culture. So a second possible relationship now is directly opposed to the first. Linguistic structure or behavior may either influence or determine social structure. So yes, linguistic structure or the behavior in the way that we use the language does influence the society or determines in the society how we use the language. Now, this is the view that is behind the Worfian hypothesis that claims of Bernstein and many of those who argue that languages rather than speakers of these languages can be sexist. So, yes, gender does make a difference. Woman would speak in a different way that a man would use the language. So, according to Worfian, or according to what Bernstein claims, that language does get affected by the speaker's gender, and it differentiates the gender. You can tell from the language use, like there are different terms for expressing that a female, to show that it's a female or a male, you see. Now, even in Urdu you would say that you could see the difference. A male would say, like if I'm going somewhere, main wahan gaya. So gaya would be used for male, and main wahan gayi would be used for a female. So you see, so it's not just the speakers of the language that are sexist or who divide it into gender, but it's the language itself. So that language is created according to the society and the society rules. So a third possible relationship is that the influence is bidirectional, and language and society may influence each other. So language and society may influence each other, yes. It can be bidirectional, and maybe language can affect the society, or even maybe society can affect the language. So that would be more true, that society is affecting the language, because we have to follow some of the social or structures or the social rules that we apply in languages. So one variant of this approach is that this influence is dialectical in nature. So yes, we could say that it's dialectical, as Marcus' view put forward by Dittmar in 1976, according to his research. And he argues that speech behavior and social behavior are in a state of constant interaction. So speech behavior and social behavior have a constant interaction or a constant relationship. And the material living conditions are an important factor in the relationship. And how we use the language, according to the society, our material living conditions would influence that relationship also. Like there is a difference in society of the different social classes. Now those different social classes would use language in a different way. Let's say that a worker, or let's say somebody who's a builder and a laborer, he would have a different way of using the language, you see, than a person who is maybe a professor. A professor would use the language in a very different way, which would be completely in contrast to what the laborer is using. So yes, social classes do affect the language, but we wouldn't say that the language affects social classes. We would say that yes, the social behavior or the social structure does affect language. So a fourth possibility is to assume that there is no relationship at all between linguistic structure and social structure. So a fourth possibility, according to that, we would say that it has no relationship between linguistic structure and social structure, and that it is independent of each other. But do you think, students, that it is independent? Because how can we use language without following the social rules or the social structure? If we would use it, then we would be offending people. Just like in the French culture or in Pakistani culture, if you call an elder by the word tum instead of aap, then that person would be offended. So that's how society would affect the language, you see. So they aren't independent. It does have a relationship. Now, a variant of this possibility would be to say that although there might be some such relationship, present attempts to characterize it are essentially premature, given what we know about both language and society. So a variant of this possibility would say that yes, there is, although there might be a relationship, but the present attempts to characterize it are essentially premature, so it's difficult to state it or characterize it in one single condition. So given what we know about both language and society, so they do have a relationship. Now actually, this variant view appears to be the one that Chomsky himself holds. So this variant would be what Noam Chomsky would follow. He prefers to develop an asocial linguistics as a preliminary to any other kind of linguistics, such as asocial approach being, in his view, would be logically prior. Now, we must, therefore, be prepared to look into various aspects of the possible relationships between language and society. So when we need to differentiate that there is a relationship between language and society, it will be quite obvious from doing so that correlational studies must form a significant part of sociolinguistic work. So correlational studies have to be a part of sociolinguistic work. So Gumpers in 1971, he researched, and according to his research, he has observed that sociolinguistics is an attempt to find correlations between social structure and linguistic structure, and to observe any changes that occur. So according to Gumpers in 71, sociolinguistics is an attempt. The reason why what sociolinguistics is doing is, it is learning the relationship between the social structure and the linguistic structure, and seeing that if both of these, do they affect each other? And are there any changes that occur, let's say if in a social structure a change occurs, would it affect the linguistic structure also? Or let's say if in the language there is a change, would it affect the society? So Chambers in 2002 is even more direct about this, and according to him, sociolinguistics is the study of social uses of the language, how language is used in the society. And the most productive studies in the 4 decades of sociolinguistic research have emanated from determining the social evaluation of linguistic variance. So yes, we would say that according to sociolinguistics research, that determining the social evaluation of linguistic variance, how language has different variants in it. Now, these are also the areas most susceptible to scientific methods, such as hypothesis formation, the logical inference, and statistical testing, how we would test the language statistically, or how a logical inference would make a difference on language. So, however, as Gumpers and others have been quick to indicate, such studies do not exhaust sociolinguistic investigations. So they don't tire the sociolinguistic investigations, because sociolinguistic investigations are very vast. And nor do they always prove to be as enlightening as one might hope. So yes, sometimes always all the factors of sociolinguistic, whatever we're investigating, they don't always enlighten us, or we don't always see it in a positive way, or it doesn't explain it very clearly. But according to that it still doesn't exhaust the investigation. That means that there is still so much room for sociolinguistics to investigate the relationship between language and society. So it is a well-known fact that a correlation shows only a relationship between two variables. So that is a well-known fact, that correlation would only show a relationship between the two variables, and it does not show ultimate causation. So it doesn't show ultimate causation, but it does show the relationship between the two variables. Now, to find that X and Y are related is not necessarily to discover that X causes Y or Y causes X. That means, like, if we would say X is society and Y is language. So to find that in sociolinguistics, what they're trying to do is they're trying to discover that not that society would cause language or language would cause society. Like, either of them don't influence each other in a way, but they do have a relationship. So X wouldn't be the cause of Y. That means that society can't be the cause of creating language, and language can't be the cause of creating rules in society. So, and for it also quite possible that some third may be factor like Z may cause both X and Y. So there could be a third factor which is affecting the society and language, or even that some far more subtle combination of factors is involved. So there could be any other number of factors that are affecting language and society. So we must always exercise caution when we attempt to draw conclusions from these such relationships. So yes, we need to attempt caution, because we don't want to draw conclusions just on the base of assumptions, saying that yes, society does affect language or language affects society. But we want to study the relationship between it very carefully. Now, a worthwhile sociolinguistics, however, must be something more than just a simple mixing of linguistics and sociology. So it's much more than just mixing sociology or linguistics, which takes concepts and findings from the two disciplines and attempts to relate them in simple ways. So we take findings from sociology, we take findings from linguistic study. We would combine both of those two disciplines, and then we would try to relate them in a simple way. Now, it certainly must go beyond Horvath's view in 1998 that sociolinguistics should just pick and choose freely from sociology. So yes, Horvath's view, according to him in 1998, the research that he conducted, that sociolinguistics would just pick and choose freely from sociology, that also wouldn't be very logical. So what my kind of sociolinguistics do is to periodically to sociology and find social networks or the linguistic marketplace. And we find these concepts terribly useful in understanding the patterns that emerge from our data. So, social networks, according to how linguistic marketplace, how it's placed in the market, or how the concepts are, they are terribly useful in understanding the patterns of the relationship when we're trying to understand the relationship between the social factors and the linguistic factors, and how society and language would merge and become one. Now, however, we are not engaged in the sociologist struggles over the importance of social networks. So, vice versa, other ways of dealing with the structure of society, and may remain blissfully unaware of whether or not these models have become contentious within the same discipline. So staying within the same discipline, we still we remain blissfully unaware. That means that we don't know that these models would deal with the structure of the society or the language structure. And they are connected with each other. So a serious scientific approach is incompatible with blissful unawareness in an essential part of its underpinnings. So Himes in 1974 has pointed out that even a mechanical amalgamation means a mixture. So even a mechanical mixture of standard linguistics and standard sociology is not likely to surface in adding a speechless sociology to a sociology-free linguistics. And we may miss what is important in the relationship between language and society. So we would say, according to Himes, that it's not a mixture of just the standard linguistic rules or the standard sociology rules, and we cannot just blend both of them and say that there is rules from sociology that we are mixing in linguistics, or that there is linguistics completely free from the rules of sociology. So both of them, what is important is the relationship. Now, we can't say that they're both independent and they're different, so there is the relationship that we have to count, the relationship between language and society. So specific points of connection between language and society must be discovered. So there has to be, we have to discover the specific points and the connections between language and society. And we need to discover them by conducting research through social linguistics. And these must be related within theories that throw light on how linguistic and social structures interact. So this research has to be conducted on the basis of these theories that to study how a linguistic structure will interact with a social structure. So according to Holmes in 1992, he says that the sociolinguistics aim is to move towards a theory which provides a motivated account of the way language is used in a community and of the choices people make when they use language. So it's, according to him, that it has to move towards a theory, and language is used in a community, and the way people would choose what language to produce or how to produce it is according to the community they live in. And it depends on the choices that those people make. Now, for example, when we observe how varied language use is, we must search for the causes. So when we study that there is such a huge difference in the way people use language in different societies, there we have to search for the causes. We have to search for the specific reasons what are causing that language structure, or what is causing the difference between, or the variation between languages. So upon observing variability, we seek its social correlates. So upon, when we are observing the variability, then we do seek social correlates. What is the purpose of the variation? Now, when we go into that question, I would like you to ponder that question also, that what is the purpose of variation? Why do we have variation in language? Then how is it evaluated in the community? How that difference is evaluated in a different community? And what do its variants symbolize? And what do they symbolize? According to Chambers in 2003, they conducted a research. Now, for Chambers, these questions are the central questions of social linguistics. So they are the central questions of social linguistics. Why? Because Chambers is not alone in holding such views. There are many other sociologists who have the same view. Now, others too believe that social linguistics is the study of language variation, the difference between language, or the variations that are created in language, and that the purpose of such study is to find out that variation tells us about language and speakers' knowledge of language. In this case, their unconscious knowledge of sociolinguistic differences. So others would believe that yes, the purpose of this study would be to find the variations and that tell us about the difference between language speakers and the knowledge of language. and their unconscious knowledge of the linguistic differences. So we will also see that there is some opposition in this idea that sociolinguistic investigations should be confined to fairly straightforward correlational studies of this kind. So yes, we can see the idea that sociolinguistic investigators would be confined fairly. That means they're just stuck into that thought that there is straightforward correlational studies of this kind. So critics such as Cameron in 1997 claim that these studies do not provide very satisfactory explanations for linguistic behavior because of inadequacies with social theory. So sometimes there is none at all, and failure to appreciate the difficulties in using social concepts. Any conclusions are likely to be the suspect. So what is needed, according to Cameron, is more social engagement. So we need to be more socially engaged so that sociolinguistics would deal with such matters as the production and reproduction of linguistic norms by institutions and socializing practices. So how these norms are apprehended, accepted, resisted, and subverted by individual actors, and that what their relation is to the construction of identity. So what is the relation between how they're constructing the language, how they're apprehending the norms of language, they're accepting it, they're resisting it. So Milroy in 2001 makes a somewhat similar claim in discussing the processes of standardization and change. How the difference between the change in language and society. So social patterns are abused only in so far as they may elucidate. Elucidate means to make clear, to try to understand. Elucidate the patterns or make clear the patterns of the language by exhibiting covariation with linguistic variables. So, and as long as internal analyses are quite strongly based, and they are biased in favor for linguistics rather than social phenomena. So maybe we would say that the internal analysis, they would be biased, they're leaning towards only in favor of linguistic structures rather than the social phenomena. So the quantitative paradigm will be to that extent embedded in its attempts to explain the social life of language and the social origins of language change. So I have already mentioned this idea of necessary social engagement, and I will return to it later. So, however, one point is clear in the above disagreement, that sociolinguistics, whatever it is about asking important questions concerning the relationship between language and society. So it's all about trying to learn what the relationship is. Now, in the pages that follow, I will try to show you some of those questions so that it would be easy for you to understand the relationship between language and society. So according to, let's conduct a discussion now. So according to a discussion, let's say number one would be to convince yourself that there are some real issues here with regard to the possible relationships between language and society. So to convince yourself, we would say that yes, there are real issues that would have a regard to the possible relationships between language and society, and that they consider your responses to the following questions and compare them with those of the others. So the part A of that would be, does an Inuit see a snow cape differently from a native of Chad visiting the cold north for the first time? Because the Inuit must be using a language developed to deal with the surrounding snowscape. So number two would be, if men and women speak differently, then is it because the common language they share has a gender bias? So yes, because boys and girls are brought up differently, true, or because part of gender marking is the linguistic choices one can indeed or must make. So yes, When we look at this factor according to our society, then men and women do speak differently. Why? Especially in your native language. The reason is because let's say that English maybe is not gender biased, right? But our language Urdu is gender biased. French is gender biased. So because boys and girls are brought up differently, so they do you think that would be the cause why they are using? But no, it's not just because they're brought up differently. It's because there is a different structure of language that is used for a male, or to differentiate the difference between a male and a female, to tell the difference between that this person is a male and this is a female. That's how those rules are used. So because it's gender marking is the linguistic choices that one can indeed make or must make, so yes, maybe that could be true also. So is language just another cultural artifact, like property, possessions, or money? Do you think language is a part of your possessions, like money or your property, which is used for the expression of power and or as a medium of exchange? So what do you want to see is that do we use language as a medium for exchange of power or the expression of power? So if language is an essential human attribute and humans are necessarily social beings, what problems and paradoxes do you see for theoretical work in sociolinguistics if the latter is to grapple with the relationships between linguistic and social factors? So yes, if you would say an essential human attribute would be humans are necessarily social beings, so they are belonging from a society. So what problems or paradoxes do you see that would cause the theoretical work in sociolinguistics if the latter would be grapple with the relationship between the linguistic and social factors? If they would have a let's say some sort of misconduct between linguistic factors and social factors. So one aspect of the power of professionals is said to be the way they are able to use language to control others. So yes, the power of a professional person, many professionals, when you are going for, let's say, an interview, or you're going for, let's say, any professional meeting, then yes, language and how we use the language is our power. And we are judged according to our communicational skills. Communication skills are very important in a human being. So it would be the power of a professional person, of how we can control the language or how we can use the language. Now, how do physicians, psychiatrists, lawyers, social workers, teachers, priests, police officers, etc. use language to control others? Because they have their own norms of language. A physician would have their own words, their own medical terms that they would use that a common person maybe cannot understand. A priest would have his own way of expressing to the common person the rules of God or a religion. Teachers, when we are explaining things to you, once again we have a different way of explaining it, and that is our communication skills. That's how we have power over the students, because we have the ability to use language in a variation. So does this same power or principle apply to parents in relation to children? Yes, parents do have more power in language than when speaking to children, or men in relation to women. So upper social classes in relation to lower social classes, does that cause a difference? Yes, because an upper social class would have a totally different way of using the language than a lower social class person would. So speakers of standard languages in relation to speakers of non-standard varieties of those languages, and so on. So sociolinguistics and sociology of language And when we come up to sociolinguistics and sociology of language, we would say that, yes, some investigators have found it appropriate to try to introduce a distinction between sociolinguistics or micro-sociolinguistics and the sociology of language or the macro-sociolinguistics. So some people have tried to work in this field, doing research, to say that there is a difference between sociolinguistics and micro-sociolinguistics, or that there is a difference between the sociology of the language and the macro-sociolinguistics. So in this distinction, sociolinguistics is concerned with investigating the relationships between language and society, with the goal being a better understanding of the structure of language and how languages function in communication. So it's all about the better understanding of the structure of language and how languages would function in communication according to the society rules. So the equivalent goal in the sociology of language is to trying to discover how social structure can be better understood through the study of language. So you see, in sociolinguistics and micro-sociolinguistics, the goal would be to understand the structure of language and how languages would function in communication, how we would use language to communicate. And in the sociology of language, we would say that it is to discover the social structure that if it is can be better understood through the study of language. For example, how certain linguistic features serve to characterize particular social arrangements. So Hudson in 1996 has described the difference as follows. Sociolinguistics is the study of language in relation to society, whereas the sociology of language is the study of society in relation to language. So sociolinguistics would be the study of language in relation to the society, whereas when we look at that sociology of language is the study of society in relation to language. The study of language in relation to society and the study of society in relation to language. That's the difference between both of them. So in other words, in sociolinguistics, we study language and society in order to find out as much as we can about what kind of thing language is. And in the sociology of language, we reverse the direction of our interests. So maybe, yes, we would reverse the direction of our interests by doing so. So using the alternative terms given above, Kolmas in 1997 says that micro-sociolinguistics investigates how social structure influences the way people talk and how social varieties and patterns of use correlate with social attributes such as class, sex, and age. So according to that, then Kolmas in 1997, he says that micro-sociolinguistics would investigate how the social structure influences how people talk. That means how society would influence the way people talk, and how language varieties or patterns would attribute to social attributes such as, or we could differentiate them between class, the sex, the gender, or the age of the person. So macro-sociolinguistics, on the other hand, studies what societies do with their languages. That is, attitudes and attachments that account for the functional distribution of speech forms in society. So language shift, maintenance and replacement, the delimitation and the interaction of speech communities. So what is macro doing then? Macro is studying what the societies would do to their languages and how they would, the attitudes and attachments that account for the functional distribution between speech forms in a society, how the language shift would be maintained, and the replacement or the delimitation and the interaction of the speech communities. Now, the view I will take here is that both sociolinguistics and the sociology of language require a systematic study of language and society if they are to be successful. So, moreover, a sociolinguistics that deliberately refrains from drawing conclusions about society seem to be unnecessarily restrictive. So just as restrictive indeed as a sociology of a language that deliberately ignores discoveries about language made in the course of sociological research. So while it is possible to do either the kind of work to the exclusion of the other, I will be concerned with looking at both kinds. So my own views are essentially in agreement with those of Colmus in 1997, expressed as follows. So there is no sharp dividing line between the two, but a large area of common concern. Now, although sociolinguistic research centers about a number of different key issues, any rigid micro or macro compartmentalization seems quite contrived and unnecessary in the present state of knowledge about the complex interrelationships between linguistic and social structures. So contributions to a better understanding of language as a necessary condition and product of social life will continue to come from both quarters of the language and linguistic structures and the social structures. So consequently, I will not attempt to make the kinds of distinctions found in Trudgill in 1978. According to his research, he tries to differentiate those studies that he considers to be clearly sociolinguistic in nature from those that are clearly not. For as he says, now while everybody would agree that sociolinguistics has something to do with language and society, it is clearly also not concerned with everything that could be considered language and society. So he's trying to make a difference or show a difference that everything is not concerned completely with language and society, but language and society are related to sociolinguistics. So the problem, therefore, would lie in the drawing of the line between language and society and sociolinguistics. How language and society would affect or what sociolinguistics is investigating. So different scholars draw the line in different places. Now, Trudgill argues that certain types of language studies are almost entirely sociological in their objectives and seem to fall outside even the sociology of language. Included in this category are the ethnomethodological studies and work by such people as Bernstein. So for Trudgill, such work is definitely not sociolinguistics, however defined, since it apparently has no linguistic objectives. So according to Trudgill, certain kinds of work combine insights from sociology and linguistics. Examples of such work are attempts to deal with the structure of discourse and conversation, speech acts, studies in the orthography of speaking, investigations of such matters as kinship systems, studies in the sociology of language, for example, bilingualism, code switching, and diglossia, and certain practical concerns such as various aspects of teaching and language behavior in classrooms also. So these would all, according to Trudgill, these are examples of the work of kinds of work combined, the insights from the sociology and linguistics, that they would affect the attempts to deal with the structure of discourse and conversation. Now, while Trudgill considers all such topics to be genuinely sociolinguistic, he prefers, however, to use that term in a rather different and somewhat narrower sense. Now, elsewhere in 1995, he says that such concerns are perhaps better summed under anthropological linguistics or geolinguistics, the social psychology of language, and so on. So for Trudgill, there is still another category of studies in which investigators show concern for both linguistic and social matters. The category consists of studies which have a linguistic intent, like those studies that would involve linguistic intent. Studies of this type are based on empirical work, on language as it is spoken and in its social context, and are intended to answer questions and deal with topics of central interest to linguists in 1978. Now, these studies are just another way of doing linguistics. Doing linguistics. Included in this category are studies of variation and linguistic change, and the seminal figure would be Leboeuf. Now, according to Trudgill, Leboeuf has addressed himself to issues such as the relationship between language and social class, with his main objective not to learn more about a particular society or to examine correlation between linguistic and social phenomena, but to learn more about language and to investigate topics such as the mechanisms of linguistic change and the nature of linguistic variability and the structure of linguistic systems. So according to Trudgill, Leboeuf had addressed these issues relating the relationship between the social classes and language, and his objective was to show that every particular society would have a correlation between linguistic and social phenomena, or they would be related in some way, but to learn more about language and to investigate topics such as the mechanism of linguistic change and the nature of the linguistic variability, how the language is, where there is a variety or a variability in the language, and the structure of the linguistic system. So that would matter also. Now, Trudgill's view is that all work in this category is aimed ultimately at improving linguistic theory and at developing our understanding of the nature of language. So, according to in 1978, now for him this is genuine sociolinguistics. Now, Chambers in 2002 and 2003 voices a similar view, and Downes in 98 echoes it. So Downes would have the similar view. Chambers was following the view of Trudgill, similarity, and so was Downes. Now, according to them, sociolinguistics is that branch of linguistics which studies just those properties of language and languages which require reference to social, including contextual factors in their explanation. So sociolinguistics, according to them, is just a branch of linguistics, and it's only studying the properties of the language or how language is required to give reference to the social structures or the contextual structures or the factors in which in their explanation of society and language. So, however, in reviewing research on language and society, now Downes' research far exceeds that of Trudgill, even that of his glossary of IT terms in 2003. So, where he characterizes sociolinguistic research as work which is intended to achieve a better understanding of the nature of human language by studying language in its social context. So, according to him, we would study language or how the nature of human language is differently viewed in the social context, or how social context would affect the language. Now, and or to achieve a better understanding of the nature of the relationship and interaction between language and society, or the interaction between how language and society affect each other. So a word of warning may be in order that Trudgill, Chambers, Downes, and I, and many others, we will come across approach to sociolinguistics from a background in linguistics rather than in sociology, or psychology, or feminist studies. Or readers should always keep that fact in mind when assessing what we say, that we are studying sociolinguistics, we are taking it from, studying it from the background of linguistics. Not from sociology, not from psychology, not from feminist studies. So totally only from the structure of linguistics that are we taking forth and studying and looking at the different factors of sociolinguistics. So as I have already indicated in referring earlier to Cameron's views in 1997, there is also a growing amount of work within a broadly defined sociolinguistics that takes what I will call an interventionist approach to matters that interest us. Now this work has been called linguistics with a conscience and a cause. So one which seeks to reveal how language is used and abused in the exercise of power and the suppression of human rights. So we would say that yes, linguistics would have a conscience of its own, and it would seek to reveal how language is used or how we abuse the language by the exercise of power, or how we use it according to the suppression of human rights, according to Widdowson in 1998. Now two of its main exponents are Fairclough in 1995, 2001, and Van Dyck in 1993. Who champion an approach called critical discourse analysis. So according to them, we would say that there is a approach that they are calling critical discourse analysis that would study the exponents of this. Now this work focuses on how language is used to exercise and preserve power and privilege in society. So how we would use language to exercise and preserve power, or how we would use privilege in society, how it buttresses social institutions, and how even those who suffer as a consequence fail to realize how many things that appear to be natural and normal are not at all normal, or they're not at all so. So there are not so because it is power relations in society that determine who gets to say what and who gets to write what. So according to society, yes, we don't have the freedom of speech. So the claim is that politics, medicine, religion, education, law, race, gender, and academia can only be understood for what they really are within the framework of critical discourse analysis, as systems that maintain an equal distribution of wealth, income status, the group membership, or education, and so on. So Fairclough, according to in 2001, expresses what he sees as a failure of sociolinguistics to deal with such matters as follows. So according to him, according to that, he would say that there is a failure to deal with sociolinguistics, and that failure is because sociolinguistics is strong on what? Questions, what are the facts of variation? And then but weak on why and how questions, or why are the facts as they are, or how in terms the development of social relationships of power. Was the existing sociolinguistic order brought into being? Now how is it sustained, and how might it be changed to the advantage of those who are dominated by it? So this is very much an ideological view, because we can't say that it's just completely based on facts, so it's more of an ideological view. Its proponents would maintain that all language use in ideological as are in all investigations, that is, that there is no hope of an objective or neutral sociolinguistics. So consequently, critical discourse analysis is ideological and judgmental. It claims the high grounds on issues. It is a resource for people who are struggling against domination and oppression in its linguistic forms. So according to Fairclough in 1995, we might well exercise caution in accessing any claims we find. Or appeals to what is right tend to shortcut genuine scientific inquiry. Now, in chapters 13 and 15, further on, that if we see examples of sociolinguistic studies, which are definitely interventionist in approach. So, according to Fairclough in 1995, according to his chapters that he wrote in 13 and 15 chapters, that he said that the examples of the sociolinguistic studies are definitely interventionist in approach. Now, according to another discussion, ethnomethodology is the study of common sense knowledge and practical reasoning. So ethnomethodology would be that how common sense knowledge is used and how we would practically reason about something. So to convince yourself that you have such knowledge and do employ such reasoning would mean that, see what happens if you react literally when someone next addresses you with such formulaic expressions as how do you do or have a nice day. So for example, you can respond by what do you mean, how do I do, or how do you define a nice day. Now be careful. You should find that common sense knowledge tells you not to take either everything you hear literally. So don't start asking people like that. If somebody asks you how you do, so you shouldn't ask them that, what do you mean by how do I do? So that would be very sarcastic. So far as practical reasoning is concerned, we collect examples of how people actually do reach conclusions, how they give directions, and relate actions to consequences or causes to effects. How we would relate it to actions, or how we would relate consequences or causes, relate that to effects. So do they do this in any scientific manner? So Bernstein, a British sociologist, has claimed that some children acquire a somewhat limited exposure to the full range of language use as a result of their upbringing, and may consequently be penalized in school because of that. So they might they have a limited exposure to language, and because of that, then maybe they would be punished in school because of it. So what kinds of evidence would you consider to be relevant to confirming or disconfirming such a claim? So conversations are not simple matters. What you can you say about each of the conversations that follows? Now I'm going to give you an example of the conversations that would follow. Do you see anything you might call structural in some that do not see it in others? So how in particular does the last fail? So what you want to do is you want to see how this conversation is and what is structural in this conversation. So first we would say, excuse me, yes. Got a match? Sorry. Thanks. Then again, that part. So, excuse me? Yes. The person replied, got a match? That means, do you have a matchbox? He said, sorry. So the other person said, thanks. Now the same thing, if we would say that, got a match? Nope. Excuse me, got a match? Yes. Offer. And silence. So that would fail in a conversational way. So Labov in 1970 has described the sociology of language as follows. It deals with large-scale social factors and their mutual interaction with languages and dialects. So there are many open questions and many practical problems associated with the decay and assimilation of minority languages, the development of stable bilingualism, the standardization of languages, and the planning of language development in newly emerging nations. So the linguistic input for such studies is primarily that a given person or group uses language X in a social context or a domain Y. So what are some of the questions and problems you see in your society? Would be that either broadly or narrowly defined, that fall within such a sociology of language. So as a further instance of a topic that might be covered in the sociology of language, you could consider who speaks English in the world, where and for what purposes do they speak English. You might also contrast what you can find out about the uses of English within what you can find out about the uses of Latin